as any hill.
It is the most
And that's
richest
sort of like that.
place.
You gotta pull it over your way.
Yeah, okay.
And she knows that. She knows.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not saying you're starting with the story, but I mean, it's lots of complex, right? Yes.
One of our cohorts was told
And
by the
I'll be back one day. Thank you. If you don't mind, yeah, so much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the kids in the classroom never complain. Good evening and welcome to the fourth in the series of Ken Morrison lectures brought to you by Lakehead Unitarian Fellowship. We are very happy to have so many people in the audience. It is customary at this time to acknowledge the presence and thank the following politicians here tonight, and I would like to recognize Senator Bob McKenzie. Excuse me. MP Bruce Heyer of Thunder Bay Superior North. Mary Kaziris representing John Rafferty of Thunder Bay Atacoca. And Paul Pugh of Thunder Bay City Council. Perhaps Paul would like to speak to us now.
Thanks very much.
They're up. Okay.
Closer. Closer.
Is it on?
There.
Yes.
That should do. So it's, I've
Not
been
on,
asked.
Paul.
All right. I'll put it back on the stand. So I was asked to bring greetings from the city of Thunder Bay, and I'm very happy to do so. I would start off as we normally do, because we have a guest from out of town, by recognizing that the city of Thunder Bay is situated within the Robinson-Superior Treaty, and it is built on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation. And we also recognize the contribution to our city from the Métis peoples. As a city councillor, and particularly as chair of the poverty reduction strategy that our city has embarked upon, I am personally very happy to welcome everyone here tonight, and our guest speaker in particular, because the topic is a timely one. It's one that is of great concern for our citizens and our city. So I am very much looking forward to tonight's talk, and I'm sure all of you are also. So Welcome everyone. Welcome to our city, and we'll get on with our meeting.
Thank you, Paul. My name is Rob Van Wyk. I'm a member of Lakehead Unitarian Fellowship, where I serve on this lecture committee, and also as a lay chaplain. We're the little church right across the street that you may have visited at some time, or perhaps you may have walked by and wonder, who are the Unitarians? And there are about as many answers to that question as there are Unitarians. Free thinkers, faith community that lets you build your own theology, no dogma, etc., etc. There is a joke about how many Unitarians it takes to change a light bulb. That perhaps would illustrate where we're coming from. Well, how many? Well, we choose not to make a statement either in favor of or against the need for a light bulb. However, if you're in your own journey, you have found that light bulbs work for you, that is wonderful, and you must change it. All this is to introduce Ken Morrison. It could be said that he changed a good number of light bulbs around town and the country. Many here will have met him, but for those of you who have not, you had to say he was a remarkable man of principle who was compelled to speak truth to power. In your brochure, it says he spoke firmly and frequently on the big issues of our time. And this is an understatement. One of the most important issues for him was the examination of the limits of tolerance in society. Another issue found him agitating against the big lies we're constantly getting from the power structures. He was a frequent letter writer to the Chronicle Journal and a constant irritant to the leadership of the NDP. Not to forget the Canadian Unitarian Council. Ken passed away in 2010, but before he did, he asked that we set up a series of lectures on the big ideas and hard questions of our time. This idea grew into an important social responsible activity for LUF. Today's lecture by Winnipeg health economist Dr. Evelyn Forget addresses quite directly the very first Unitarian principle embraced by Ken and Unitarians worldwide, that we should affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. These lectures have been self-supporting because of the generosity of over 50 people who have contributed in the past. We greatly appreciate their support and invite their continued assistance. And won't you consider helping us with a charitable donation to the Ken Morrison Lectures? There is a form on the back of your brochure. I just happen to have one if you need one. And Jean Morrison can take your money tonight at the door. Now, to give you, I'm sorry. Jean number 2. Jean Armstrong will take your money. Jean Morrison will sit there and behave herself. Now, to give you an idea of how the evening will unfold, after these introductions and Dr. Forget's lecture, there will be an opportunity for a limited number of questions. And I'm telling you this now so that if you are inclined to ask one, you will have the opportunity at your seat to focus yourself on your question and limit yourself to very few remarks. I'm sure you get the message. Before I turn over the microphone to Jean Morrison, I must acknowledge the public spiritedness of the Board of Directors and the Social Responsibility Committee of the Bay Credit Union, who sponsored this evening's venue and the refreshments. The Bay... Is there someone here from the Bay Credit Union who we can eyeball, I think?
I'm an early member.
I'm a member. I got a card. All right.
Okay, Rob, James on the board.
Jean Armstrong.
Jean Armstrong's on the board. Okay, thank you. No, seriously, the Bay Credit Union is an organization who truly walks the talk of their principles, and we are most appreciative of their assistance. I would like to introduce Jean Morrison now and invite her to say a few words. Jean.
Well, it's a big thrill to see so many of you here, and I know that Ken would have been thrilled to see so many of you, because as Rob said, this was his idea. Until the end, Ken's mind was always buzzing around with ideas. At first he thought computers were a useless gadget, but once he got onto mine, he had to get one of his own. And that didn't stop him from always being at the computer, typing out his ideas and forwarding them to others. He had the opportunity to share his ideas, mostly at the Unitarian Fellowship across the street and through his letters to the editor. Now, he didn't always have encouragement from his spouse, I must confess. But nevertheless, it was at the very end when he came up with the idea of having these lectures. And so I know what kind of wonderful speech we're going to have, because I heard our guest being interviewed on CBQ today. So it was a real little taste of the wonderful things we're going to hear. And I do hope that her remarks will stimulate everyone here to try to do their bit to help make this a fairer world for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean. I invite Jay Stapleton to introduce our speaker.
Hello, I'm up here today as more of an aficionado, or a fan, I guess, of social sciences and how they can be applied in public policy. Our society has this, it's almost a cruel trick that the effects of poverty are also the causes of poverty. And this cycle has trapped a great number of people. And it's a constant question, in political debates especially, of how do we break that cycle? And it seems like it should have come up before now that maybe we could just buy it out. Maybe the solution to poverty is money. Perhaps what we need for people to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps is to give them a pair of boots. And I've been reading on this subject for several months as part of my studies and came across Dr. Forget's papers, and it struck me as an idea that seemed so obvious it must have spent a lot of time being buried, as obvious ideas often do. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Evelyn Forget.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight, and I am so pleased that so many of you took time out of your schedules to come and listen to me talk about my little project on a Friday night. I've been working on this for a number of years, and what I want to do, as this is coming up on the screen, I want to take you back in your minds to the 1970s. And I look around the audience, and I think about half of you could probably remember the 1970s. And the other half of you should remember your history classes. And for those of us who can remember, we remember the 1970s as being a time of pretty significant social upheaval, but it was also a time of significant economic upheaval. And it's important to remember that because people always point to the economy as the reason we can't do anything. We can't fix poverty because, well, economic times are bad. Let's wait until things are better. But if you remember the 1970s were a time when interest rates spiked at about 18 or 20%, inflation was running at 10%, unemployment was far higher than it ever had been, and all of the economic tools that we thought we had to fix it didn't seem to be working anymore. There were a couple of big oil price shocks, as there have been recently. Economic times during the 1970s were pretty tough too. So,
You changed this. And here we go. Public embarrassment. What is working now? What has?
Did you just hold up and swap you?
Bottom left, big square. Bottom, okay, back left.
I have a guide.
I have a paper copy in my coat pocket. I never trust people with laptops.
Bottom left.
It's already open.
No, go on.
You're such a teacher.
See where it says normal view? Okay, that's where.
Namaste.
That's not it.
Swap you.
Full screen.
Swap you.
How do I swap view? That's what you need to do is swap. Oh, he has the full one here. There's the mouse here. So, the one that.
We are a very remote community,
I said, no, I won't bring my laptop. You should bring yours because you know how to make it work with the projector. Well, let me tell you a little bit about income while they're getting the slides up. So the 1970s were a time, as I said, of social and economic upheaval, but they were also a time when the Canadian government embarked on probably the most ambitious social experiment that's ever taken place in Canada. In the province of Manitoba, in two communities, Winnipeg and a small town of Dauphin, Manitoba. Dauphin had about 10,000 people in the town proper, and another 2,500 in the rural municipality in the farmland around Dauphin. And in those two communities, they attempted to run a guaranteed annual income experiment. Now, the payouts to the families in these experiments were relatively modest. The easiest way to think of it is to think of it as a refundable tax credit. It's very much like the child tax credit. If the family had no income from any other source, they received a stipend that would be about equal to what they would have received on provincial welfare. The innovation of the guaranteed income was that for every dollar they received from other sources, they got to keep part of their benefits, right? So if they earned $10 on the labor market, their benefits were reduced by $5. If they earned $100 on the labor market, their benefits would be reduced by $50. And what that means is that unlike provincial welfare, which really doesn't do very much for the working poor, the income scheme, the guaranteed annual income, supplements the incomes of people who are working at very low wage jobs as well. So that was the distinction. How are we doing with the slides? Sure, absolutely. If you think about it as a refundable tax credit, that's the way to do it. Right? So if you think about the child benefit, if the family has no income, there's a certain payout. As their income increases, the benefits are reduced. And so that's how it works. And they called it at the time a negative income tax, right? So they essentially paid people if they had no income. As their income increased, the benefit that they received got smaller until eventually they received enough money to pay income taxes. So the difference between provincial welfare and the guaranteed annual income is that provincial welfare has a very strong threshold effect. As
Oh, I'm gonna get the credit.
The project was funded 75% by the federal government and 25% by the provincial government in Manitoba. Federally, it was the Trudeau Liberals. Provincially, it was the very first ever NDP government in Manitoba. It was a very young government. They were having quite a lot of fun because the opposition called them communists. So they actually played it very strongly, and they took this on. And in Canada, this project was very much a social democratic project. This was one of 5 guaranteed annual income experiments that were run across North America. There were actually 4 in the US. And in the US, the support for these projects was very much from the other end of the political spectrum. Oddly enough, one of the big supporters in the US was Milton Friedman, a name that might mean something. This is an idea that actually had quite a lot of support right across the political spectrum. On the left, people were looking at it from the perspective of social justice. This is about ensuring that everybody has enough to survive. On the right, people were looking at it as a simplification of the way we delivered social assistance, an elimination of duplicated bureaucracies. This is actually a very simple program to operate, so it's a relatively cheap program to operate, and those were the savings that the right was looking for. There's also built into the scheme, if you think about it, a strong incentive to work. This is getting better and better. I don't do maths.
Well, we could do it. Who's got a laptop?
You'll excuse me for a minute, I actually have this on paper somewhere. No, but I'm happy to go without the slides. They may be. So just to recap where we are. If a family received no income from any other source, they received an amount of money that was about equal to what they would have received in provincial welfare. So for people without any income, from a financial point of view, they would have been equally well off on the two programs. So for those people, it isn't a matter of which program was better. They received the same amount of money for both. There were other aspects of the program that I'll talk about in a minute that made it superior for people without income. For people who did earn low wages, however, for minimum wage workers, for people who didn't work enough hours to generate a reasonable living on the labor market, this program provided a supplement that they wouldn't have received through the existing social programs. So it covered many more people than the existing provincial welfare. Now, the Mincome experiment had two experimental sites in Manitoba. One was in Winnipeg, and as I said, one was in Dauphin, Manitoba. And the Dauphin site was interesting because it was the only site in all 5 experiments across North America that was a saturation site. And what is meant by a saturation site is that everybody in town got to participate. In Winnipeg, it was only a very small proportion of the population, but in Dauphin, everybody received the promise that if their income fell below the threshold, they'd receive a top-up, they'd receive a stipend. And the purpose of the Mincome project was to answer a question that bothered a lot of people at the time. If you give people money and you don't make them work, why would anybody work? Why wouldn't everybody quit their job? So the purpose of this experiment was to find out if in fact everybody quit their job, if the number of hours worked fell dramatically. Now, some research was done on the labor market results at the time, and it was discovered that the number of hours worked did fall under the Mincome experiment in Winnipeg. In fact, they fell by about 13%. And that sounds like a lot. It sounds like a very damaging statement to say that if you introduce a guaranteed annual income, people are going to work 13% fewer hours. But there are a couple of really interesting results that come out of that if you look at it more closely. It turns out that grown-up people who have real jobs don't quit them. Nobody quits a job earning $50,000 a year because they'd like to live on $10,000 a year. Those jobs, people continue to work. The people who reduced the number of hours they worked fell into 2 categories. First of all, married women. Married women use the guaranteed income to buy themselves longer maternity leaves. Okay. In the 1970s, maternity leaves were about 6 weeks. And with the guaranteed income, people use that money to extend maternity leaves for, in many cases, up to a year. So they essentially did what we've decided as a society is a very positive thing. They stayed home with newborn children for longer periods of time to enhance bonding and family functioning. The other group of people who reduced the number of hours they worked dramatically were, and here I'm using the language of the period, young unattached males. And young unattached males reduced the number of hours they worked by up to 80%. And if you're not a supporter of a guaranteed annual income, that sounds terrible. That's exactly where we are. So they work fewer hours. No reduction among adults working full-time jobs. Significant effects for married women who use the guaranteed income to buy themselves longer maternity leaves. And young unattached males who reduce the hours they work by up to 80%. And you'll see I've used slightly different language on the slide. because when I looked a little closer at the data, it turned out that I found some of those young unattached males. They were in math class. They reduced the number of hours they worked by taking their first full-time job at a slightly older age. So instead of leaving school at the age of 16, as they were legally entitled to do, some of them decided to stay in high school just a little bit longer, and I'll show you that in a minute. And so instead of taking their first full-time job at 16, they might have taken their first full-time job at 17 or 18. And when you count the number of hours worked, that means a pretty significant reduction in the number of hours. Hard to see that as a bad thing. So we did get a reduction in the number of hours worked. On the whole, that's probably a pretty positive outcome. Okay, thank you. I was interested in the health and social effects of income. And one of the things that happened was that the research funding started to run out midway through the experiment. The economic conditions of the 1970s were a real challenge, and they were a challenge both for the experimenters and also for the politicians. And about 2 years into the experiment, the government in Manitoba changed, and that very first ever NDP government in Manitoba was replaced by a much less sympathetic government who decided that they really weren't prepared to put more money into the experiment. And a couple of years later, the Trudeau government was replaced in Ottawa. So the economic challenges and the political changes meant that the experiment started to run out of money. Now, the experiment was run by economists, and in particular, it was run by labor economists, and they were interested in that work question. How much did people work? They weren't nearly as interested in the health and social effects, and so they reacted to the fall in their budget by firing all the sociologists on the project. They continued to pay the families, but all of those peripheral projects got cut. So we didn't find out anything about the health and social effects during the period. They weren't a primary research question. So the data was collected by questionnaire. It was put into boxes. There was no analysis done. No database was ever made to answer any of the social questions. And then the boxes were promptly lost when the experiment ended. And this is 1979. Boxes are gone. And I began working on this project probably about 5 years ago, and I wondered whether I could find any of this data and whether I could find out what the effects might have been. And your remote doesn't seem to want to work. Is the screen? All right, back. So I started to look for those boxes, and it took me a little while to track them down. I finally found them. I found the data. And I found 1,800 cardboard boxes full of data under the control of the Archives of Canada. And then I opened the boxes and I looked inside and promptly gasped because I found total disarray. There were confused data, empty questionnaires, missing data. There were interviews with subjects and all kinds of things. It was largely unusable. And so I wondered whether there might be another way to get at some of the results from the study. And this is just a little reminder. The project ran from 1974 to 1978. And the first thing I did was to call up my contact in the Department of Education in Manitoba. Thank you. And he spent all kinds of time developing spreadsheets for me on enrollment in all the high schools in Manitoba over the period of the 1970s. And I never quite know what colors are going to show up when I put this up. But what I did was to gather data on enrollment in grade 11 and grade 12. And I constructed these little bars where grade 12 enrollment as a percent of the previous year's grade 11 enrollment. I divided the data into 3 categories: Dauphin, Winnipeg, which is the only urban center in Manitoba, and the rest of Manitoba. And if you look at that data, you see some really interesting things. If nothing happens to the underlying population and everybody in grade 11 continues to grade 12, those bars should reach 100%. The bigger your dropout rate between grade 11 and grade 12, the more those bars fall below 100%. And so the money is flowing from income between 1974 and 1978. So if you look at the first 4 years there, 1971, 1972, 1973, and even 1974, you see pretty much what you expect to see. Kids in Winnipeg are continuing on to grade 12 at a higher rate than the kids in the rest of Manitoba. There's virtually no difference between Dauphin and the rest of Manitoba. But look what happens in 1975. Continuation into grade 12 in Dauphin increases, and it increases so much that they're more likely to go to grade 12 in Dauphin than they are in Winnipeg. So that's a big spike. Look at 1976. The bar goes above 100%. Kids who'd already dropped out of school in Dauphin were coming back to grade 12 to finish grade 12 in Dauphin. 1977, Dauphin stays at almost 100%. 1978, Dauphin stays at almost 100%. Those kids are more likely to continue on to grade 12 and to finish high school than our kids even in an urban setting. Money stops by 1979, and the results in Dauphin go right back to where they were before, virtually indistinguishable from the rest of Manitoba. So what we've got is a little bubble there, a lucky cohort of kids, exactly coincident with income, who are continuing on in high school. So that's a pretty dramatic finding. And I wanted to look at some other databases that might be available and might throw light on what was happening. And the next database I looked at was that one. The data that's collected routinely through our universal health insurance, the equivalent of OHIP. Every time you go to visit a doctor, quite a lot of data is collected about you. Every time you spend time in the hospital, quite a lot of data is collected about you. This is an anonymized database, so I don't have people's names or addresses, but I know where they live. I have their 6-digit postal code, and so I can place them. So if you've lived in Manitoba at any time since 1970, I've got you in the population registry, and I've got you identified by 2 numbers. There's a 6-digit family number, which means that I can track family formation and family breakdown. I can track marriages and divorces. I can link parents to children. And I've got a 9-digit individual number, which means I can follow you over your life. I have your 6-digit postal code of residence, which is updated every 6 months. And that means that I can link you to an awful lot of information about you on the long form census. If you spend time in the hospital, I've got up to 9 codes saying why you're there, up to 9 diagnoses. I know how many days you were there, whether you're transferred between hospitals, and I know an awful lot about what happened to you while you were there. If you saw a doctor, I know what doctor it was and whether the doctor prescribed something to you and why you think you went to see him and what he billed for. It's tied into vital statistics, so I can confirm birth and cause of death. And there's quite a lot. That database has gotten much richer. Right now we have well over 100 databases that are tied together. For the early 1970s, that was pretty much what I had. But that's quite a lot of data. And what that means is that I can go into that database and I can find everybody who's living in Dauphin during the period of income. I can find out whether they're going to the hospital. I know why they're going to the hospital. And so I decided to look at this data and to see whether I could find anything out about it. Did I? No, I went too far. All right. So, our challenge. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. A lot of things have happened since 1974. I want to talk about causation. I want to make sure that any changes that happen are actually the result of income and not the result of something else. And so what I tried to do was to construct a comparison group. A group of people very much like the people who were living in Dauphin. I tried to find 3 other Manitobans who were living in similar kinds of places and were similar kinds of people. And then I could compare what happened to the Dauphin residents to the other people, because the only difference between them was whether or not they'd received the guaranteed income. So, you know. Okay.
Are we there?
Yeah, down one more. Okay, so the first thing I did was to match on geography. Turn down one more. And so I've got Dauphin marked on the map. And if you know anything about Manitoba, you know that really there's only one urban center in Manitoba. And if you think about the 1970s, a town like Winnipeg is going through social changes at a much faster rate than many of the smaller towns in Manitoba. And so I took everybody who was living in Winnipeg out of the database. And what I had left were a whole lot of people living in places very much like Manitoba. I took out of the database everybody living in northern Manitoba, because the north is different from the south. And I took out people who were living on reserves. And I did that because if you live on a reserve, your health care is the responsibility of the federal government, so you don't show up in the provincial database in quite the same way. And what that means is that I've got left in that database everybody who's living in places very much like Dauphin. And then I tried to find 3 similar kinds of people for every individual in Dauphin. One more, please. So you could do 2 more. So I matched on other characteristics. First of all, I matched on individual characteristics, because the biggest predictors of your healthcare utilization is how old you are and your sex. Secondly, I matched family size and similar kinds of families. So if you were living in a family with a single parent, I matched 2 other single parent families. And then I matched on community characteristics. If you were living in a small town or if you were living in a rural area, I matched on that. And one more. Sorry. So I had everybody who was living in Dauphin matched to 3 other very similar people. And when I looked at it carefully, I found that there were excellent matches on all the matching variables, but I also went back to the long-form census to find out whether there were any differences between my subjects and my controls. One more. And I found exactly 2 differences. First of all, I found that if you were a farmer living in Dauphin, you were much more likely to be growing canola than if you were living elsewhere in the province. Now, I'm a city girl, and I looked at that and I thought, would that have any effect on health? And I have no way of knowing, so I went to the experts in the Faculty of Agriculture, and I said, okay, suppose you're farming canola and you're farming wheat. Any reason to think that the health outcomes would be different? And so all of these guys came up with some very creative explanations for why it might be different, but I didn't believe any of them. So I think it's probably not important. It's significant, but it's not important. The second difference is ethnicity, and I'm going to leave that out there because it may or may not be important. As you drive west across this country from Thunder Bay, you come across lots of little towns, and some of those little towns are Ukrainian towns, like Dauphin, and some of them are Dutch towns, and some of them are German towns, and some of them are Polish towns, and some of them are Mennonite towns. Turns out that Dauphin is more Ukrainian than controls. About 1/3 of the people living in Dauphin claimed Ukrainian heritage. Among my controls, only about 10% were. So I'm going to leave that question there. Does ethnicity matter? I don't think it does, and the reason I don't think it does is because the Ukrainian community's been established there for a pretty long time, and so in many cases we're talking about 2nd, 3rd, and 4th generation Manitobans, but I'll leave it there to talk about it. Okay, so I had pretty good controls. What does it mean? The first thing I wanted to know was whether they're any healthier, whether it mattered that they received the guaranteed income. So I looked at hospitalization rates among my subjects in Dauphin and my controls. That blue line represents Dauphin. And you can see that before 1974, Dauphin residents are much more likely to be hospitalized than are the controls. From 1974 through 1978, those lines start to come together. By the end of the MINCOM period, there's no significant difference between Dauphin and the controls. And if I put that in a slightly different way, that means that hospitalization rates among the Dauphin residents relative to the controls fell by about 8.5%. Now that's actually very significant because it turns out that Canada spends quite a lot of money on hospitals. In 1978, Canada was spending about $7.5 billion a year on hospitals. Right now, we're spending well over $50 billion a year on hospitals. So if we can reduce hospitalization rates by 8.5%, we're talking about a pretty significant savings in associated social programs. Now, why should people be going into the hospital less simply because they receive a guaranteed annual income? Well, I think we know that poor health is strongly related to poverty, but I wanted to find out exactly what diagnoses might be responsible for those outcomes. So I started to drill into the data a little bit more to see what I could find. And the first thing I looked at was a big category of hospitalizations called accidents and injuries. Now, accidents and injuries are picking up all kinds of things. This category is picking up things like family violence and suicide attempts, the results of drunk driving, automobile accidents, workplace accidents. All those things are showing up in this category. And what do we find? This light line here at the bottom is my control group. And over the entire period, there's a slight increase in the number of hospitalizations, the rate of hospitalization for accidents and injuries. Before 1974, Dauphin residents are much more likely to be hospitalized for accidents and injuries than the controls. Between 1974 and 1978, those lines start to come together. 1978, no significant difference. I followed those people all the way to 1985, and the gap didn't open. So my Dauphin residents are, by the end of the period, no more likely than anybody else to be hospitalized for accidents and injuries. The second category that turned out to be significant was hospitalizations with mental health diagnoses. And again, over that period, you can see a slight increase over the period for the control group. Dauphin again starts out with a higher rate of hospitalization. The gap closes during the period. By 1978, it disappears, and it doesn't reopen, at least until 1985. So mental health diagnoses are another very big reason why hospitalization rates declined. Okay, I looked at visits to family doctors. It turns out that the same pattern occurred with respect to family doctors. Dauphin residents were, by the end of the period, we saw a significant reduction in the number of visits by Dauphinites relative to the controls. And we also looked to see whether there were any other effects. And we looked for three specific effects. We looked at birth outcomes. By birth outcomes, I mean low birth weight babies, babies who died just before or just after birth, small babies. We looked at birth rates, and we looked at birth rates because this was part of the political discussion of the period. If you remember all those irresponsible, unattached young men who were running away from their jobs, the other political argument at the time against the guaranteed annual income was that birth rates would increase. People would stay home and have babies in order to increase their entitlement under the program. So we looked to see if, in fact, birth rates increased over the period. And thirdly, we looked at divorce rates. Now, that might sound odd. I think a lot of people who work in the area can imagine a lot of marriages that probably should end. And a guaranteed annual income makes it possible for some of those marriages to end. People aren't staying together simply because they're afraid of the consequences if they leave abusive spouses. But that isn't exactly the way it was played out. This became a very political issue in the US, and in fact, it hit Congress and it hit the Senate. And it was being portrayed as an attack on the American family. When the initial data started to come in from the US experiments, it looked like the divorce rate was soaring. And so the question was, does a guaranteed annual income constitute an attack on the American family, or in this case, the Canadian family? And since I had the data, we decided to look at that as well. So first of all, I looked at birth outcomes. Now, birth outcomes are very often strongly associated with poverty, and it turned out I didn't find any effects. And I was a little disappointed not to find them. I looked at birth outcomes as many different ways as I could think to look at them, and nothing showed up as significant. I think the biggest explanation for why that might have been is because of the small number of babies born. It was a town of 13,000, but 13,000 people don't actually generate that many babies over a period of 4 years. So I think statistically it was just not enough to show up. But I think there are two other reasons why we might not have seen those results. Poor birth outcomes are very often associated with poverty for two reasons. First of all, poor nutrition during pregnancy. And secondly, the lack of prenatal care. One of the things that distinguished Canada from the US during this period is that we did have universal health care. So whether you received a guaranteed annual income or not, you still had the same access to prenatal care. And secondly, this was a small town in Manitoba, and a lot of people were engaged in food production themselves. They had big gardens, they had chickens in the backyard. I don't think that poverty showed up as food insecurity in quite the same way that it would today, particularly in a large city. So I didn't find those results. I can also happily report that this is a picture of the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Dauphin. And it's just there as a reminder that when we start talking about birth rates and divorce rates, there are a lot of other factors besides a guaranteed annual income that we have to take into account. You'll be happy to know that the birth rates did not increase, and in fact, birth rates fell dramatically in Dauphin during the period. In fact, they fell further and faster than they were falling across the rest of North America, where they were also falling rather dramatically. So people were not increasing family size in order to increase their entitlement. And you'll also be happy to know that the divorce rate in Dauphin did not increase during the period. So while the guaranteed annual income may be an attack on the American family, the Canadian family is apparently safe. Nobody divorced. It turns out that I think children may have been most affected. They tended to stay in high school longer. They had their first child at an older age, and they tended to have fewer children over a lifetime as a consequence of the guaranteed annual income. And all of those things are associated with better outcomes in terms of income and so on. So I guess the question we want to ask is, are these results still applicable? Do they still matter in the 21st century? And just to raise a few of the issues, I think one thing that I've been emphasizing on this is that a guaranteed annual income is associated with potential savings in other social programs associated with poverty. Now, I've talked about healthcare because the data I have lets me talk about reductions in hospitalization rates. But it doesn't, in fact, take a great deal of imagination to realize that a lot of special education funding is also associated with poverty. That criminal justice tends to be associated with poverty. Family violence expenditure is associated with poverty. If we can make some reductions in the rate of poverty, we can expect to see savings in other kinds of social programs. The second point is that a guaranteed annual income is in principle a very simple program to administer. During the 1970s, people received their checks from income on a monthly basis. They actually had to show up with pay stubs. But if you imagine how this program would work today, it would work in the same way that any other refundable tax credit works. It would work through the income tax system, through the existing bureaucracy. All right. I think one of the savings from the duplicating bureaucracies is that we spend an awful lot of time right now, an awful lot of social worker time, trying to help clients navigate the bureaucracy, trying to help clients find their way through a very complicated bureaucracy of social programs. Imagine being able to take some of those highly dedicated and highly educated social workers and take them away from that task and put them into the task of actually running programs that they're trained to run and that would actually help people with the problems they face. I think a guaranteed income is particularly useful for youth unemployment and underemployment. One of the things a guaranteed income does is to subsidize low wages without distorting the labor market in the same way that increases in the minimum wage will. So it doesn't reduce the number of jobs on offer, and in fact it might make some people more employable than they otherwise would be. It's a way of subsidizing low wages. Most important, at least from my perspective, what's most important is a guaranteed annual income empowers families to make their own decisions and to make their own mistakes. People don't always make the decisions you would like them to make when you give them the freedom to do what they want. But a guaranteed income doesn't infantilize people, and it doesn't encourage dependency. So, what's left? What's missing, I think, from my little presentation so far is that we don't have much of a story about how the families who received income thought that the program affected their lives. Now, I got a call from a reporter at the Free Press a few years ago, and she said, okay, I hear you have this interesting project, tell me about it. So I told her about it, 8.5% reduction in hospitalization rates, a significant reduction in visits to family doctors, et cetera, et cetera. She said, yeah, that's pretty boring. I'd like to talk to some of the people. And I said, well, turns out I'm not allowed to put you in contact with the people. The ethics board says that I have to protect people's privacy. And she said, ethics. Yeah, I'm a reporter. I don't have to worry about ethics. And so she went to Dauphin, and she went to the retirement home, and she started buying people coffee. And I believe the question she asked was, okay, who wants their picture in the newspaper? And it turned out that she had a lot of takers. Here's the first one, Amy Richardson. And a picture of Amy Richardson's family in the 1970s. Amy Richardson had a husband who was ill, who retired at the age of 53, and in fact he died during the Lincoln experiment. She had 6 kids, so she ended up as a young widow with 6 kids, and being a very independent person, she decided to raise money by running the Dauphin Beauty Parlor out of her home, out of her kitchen, and Mincome came along. And Mincome, she said, allowed her to add some cream to the coffee. It allowed to purchase her a few little luxuries, like school books for her kids. It was to bring her income up to where it should be. It was to add some cream to the coffee. Everybody was the same, so there was no shame. And that's what we heard over and over again. This second couple, Hugh and Doreen Henderson, are very representative of the families that we found in the boxes. He was a janitor at a school, which at the time was a seasonal job and not a particularly well-paying job. She was a stay-at-home mom. They had 2 kids. They raised a lot of their own food, very large garden, kept chickens in the backyard. And Hugh says, if a kid wants an education and he's willing to pay for it, I think the government should help. If we'd have had more money, I would have loved to pay for university for my kids. Doreen, give people enough money to raise their kids. People work hard and it's still not enough. This isn't welfare. This is making sure kids have enough to eat. They should have kept it. It made a real difference. And this guy's my favorite, Rick Sablitney. He's my favorite because he's a chartered accountant. And this is the sort of person you would almost expect to say, why should I pay my tax dollars to support a program that I'm never going to benefit from? Because realistically, his income is too high and probably would always be too high. But in fact, he was a big supporter of income. He said, we always felt the problem with the welfare system is it was punitive. You made money and they took it away from you. It seemed to us that income was for people who were on that line. They weren't deadbeats, they needed a bit of a boost. I'd be in favor of it now. Helping someone have a decent living wage is hard to argue with. And I think I'd like to end my little presentation today just by talking about the renewed interest, I think, in guaranteed annual income. And it's really coming from two sources. There's quite a lot of interest in Europe for a number of reasons. Switzerland had a citizens' referendum in the past year. The European Union received a popular petition last year and is about to debate the concept of a basic income. The second big area of support, oddly enough, comes under a different name. The World Bank has been supporting the use of what they're calling unconditional cash transfer schemes as a means of addressing poverty in low-income countries. And that's met with incredible success. These are usually designed to encourage families to keep their daughters in school, to educate their daughters. And they find that you don't actually have to tell families how to spend the money. If you give families enough money, families can actually make pretty good decisions themselves about how to spend the money in order to improve the quality of life of that family. So giving the family the resources they need to make good decisions usually leads to pretty good outcomes. And so that's the second source, I think, of support for guaranteed income. And I think I'm just going to leave it there and ask whether there might be any questions. And I do apologize for this.
Thank you for the enthusiastic response. It feels like we're just getting to the tip of the iceberg on a fascinating topic. I'm sure there are questions in the audience.
But before our questions, one thing, thank you very much, Dr. Forget. We have an announcement from Bill King. Where are you, Bill?
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm the president of the local branch of the Canadian International Council. It's a foreign affairs awareness group across the country. It's under base, lucky enough to have a branch. We have a speaker coming up on Thursday night, and it occurred to me that this audience is probably very interested in the kind of speaker we have coming up on Thursday night. It's Dr. Judith Marshall, who recently retired from the Global Affairs Department of the Steelworkers Union. Her specific interest is unions, particularly in developing countries like South Africa, and how the development of their unions can impact us more favorably. I think Paul would be a perfect person to talk to about that. How often have we heard that jobs are going to move offshore from Canada because it's cheaper in other areas and so on? And this is how lower the workforce is. You know, we've got to cut corners and so on. Her perspective is that if we could develop unions in these other countries and raise their standard of living and their wages and such, that sort of competition will eventually even out. It's a very global perspective. So it's at the Faculty Lounge of Lakehead University on Thursday night at 7:15. If you're interested in attending the dinner, which is prior to that, speak to the distinguished-looking gentleman, Ernie Epp, over here, who is willing to sell you a dinner ticket. Otherwise, if you'd just like to attend the speaker, there's a $10 charge for the speaking event. Again, at the Faculty Lounge on Thursday. Thank you very much.
So we have an opportunity for questions, and assuming that there may be many people who would like to ask a question, we'd ask you to be brief in your presentation of the question, and Evelyn will respond. There's a microphone over there. If you'd like to line up at the microphone, we'll recognize people.
I was just curious about the financial aspect.
Sorry, if you could say your name.
Oh, Carl Rowe. I was interested in the financial aspect. You said that it was cut off because of funding, but surely the guaranteed annual income takes the place of welfare, so there shouldn't have been, except for the research part, there shouldn't have been that much difference in it.
There were two aspects to it. First of all, the research part of it was tremendously expensive. They had, if you think about the way this was done in the 1970s, they had armies of kids out there interviewing, but they also had armies of key punch operators trying to create databases and trying to turn this into a database, which they never succeeded in doing. But they actually employed hundreds of people for this experiment. It did take the place of welfare, but it was almost a one-for-one swap for people who were on welfare. But it also covered many other people, as I was saying at the beginning. So there were all of these subsidies to the working poor. And if you think of a town like Dauphin, which is agriculturally dependent, you've got a lot of seasonal workers, a lot of farm workers who are low income, who often don't work a full year. So many of these people would have received subsidies, but wouldn't necessarily have been eligible for welfare. I guess the third thing I can say about that, I talked to a number of social workers during the period, and a young man, for example, who had no income, your welfare might very well be a bus ticket to Winnipeg and a suggestion that you get a job. Under income, they actually qualified for support. So there was there were all kinds of sort of cultural and social expectations about who should collect welfare and who shouldn't collect welfare that didn't necessarily carry over into the program. So there were additional expenses. The other thing was that in terms of planning for the experiment, no one expected the unemployment rate to be quite as high as it turned out to be during the period. So when they planned the project, they planned for a certain level of unemployment, and in the event they miscalculated. The unemployment rate turned out to be much higher, and so the number of families qualifying for support turned out to be higher than they expected. So they needed additional money for it to continue, and it wasn't forthcoming. So that's what happened.
Okay, no, that's interesting. We'd like to get into that in more detail too. But I'm involved with Poverty Free Thunder Bay, and one of our big focuses is to eliminate poverty, is to increase income, and we're simply looking at raising the minimum wage to $14 an hour, and to raise the rates of Ontario Disability Support Program and the Ontario Works, because the gap between what would be considered like a livable one, like even the basic measure of adequacy for a household, like for one single person, 13,710. On OW, it says they're getting 7,502 a year. So it's grotesque. It's terrible. But you're saying that like for the minimum wage, to have raise the minimum wage, that's distorting the labor market, and this will not help the situation. Whereas we thought, raise the minimum wage, then they have no excuse at all for not raising the welfare, because all that argument about people want to have an incentive to work and blah, blah, blah. So, no, could you elaborate?
It's very controversial. If you raise the minimum wage, what will happen to the number of jobs on offer? And I think until a few years ago, most economists would say that if you raise the minimum wage, there will be fewer jobs offered. Employers will reduce the number of hours of labor. If you think about a little cafe will simply hire fewer waiters and offer fewer hours of work. Now that turns out not always to be the case, and it's very controversial, and there's quite a lot of evidence out there to say that there's not going to be this huge reduction in the number of jobs on offer. But it does cause a certain distortion, and I think one of the really nice things about a guaranteed income, and perhaps I haven't said it as clearly as I ought to have, but one of the really nice things about a guaranteed income is that it doesn't make a stark distinction between people with disabilities, people who ought to work and people who are incapable of working. You can imagine a guaranteed income, for example, that would subsidize the earnings of people with certain kinds of disabilities. They may not be employable at $12 an hour, but they might be employable at a lower wage that could be subsidized with a guaranteed income. And I think that sort of nice continuity, at least from my perspective, that sort of nice continuity means not labeling people quite so directly, and letting people find their place in the labor market as they can and make their way. And using a guaranteed income is just a way of ensuring that everybody can live a decent life, however they land in the labor market.
Hi, Dr. Forget. My name is Bruce Hire. It's great to hear such wonderful science, and wouldn't it be wonderful if once again we had policy based on science rather than science based on ideology. I, for many years, have been espousing some sort of guaranteed annual income, and the question that comes up again and again is, how do you pay for it?
Yeah.
So I have a suggestion to you and others, and I've written an essay on it, and if anybody sends me an email, I'll be happy to send you the essay. But Canadians, the majority of Canadians now believe that we need some sort of carbon tax.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's an idea out there from the Citizens Climate Lobby called the carbon fee and dividend. And the reason it's called a fee and not a tax is none of the money would go to government. It would go to a trust fund, and once again be paid out directly through the Canada Revenue Agency on a per capita basis to every Canadian. So overall, it would be revenue neutral. And if you're poor and or a carbon conserver, you would make money on that deal. And if you were affluent and or have a Hummer and a big house and travel by airplane a lot, you'll pay quite a bit. I wonder if you're familiar with this concept of a carbon fee and dividend, and whether you think merging these two big social and technological and economic issues might help answer that question of how we pay for it.
I think that's a really neat idea. I have read about it, and it's a variation on an idea, as I'm sure you're aware, that's already already being used in other places. Not so much the carbon tax, but this notion of a fee and dividend. It's sort of the basis of the Alaska Permanent Dividend Fund. And adding the carbon aspect to it is a very interesting way of moving forward. So I think it's a brilliant idea. And I think there are a number of different ways. I mean, I don't want to be dogmatic. When I talked about the guaranteed income, I talked about the way it was designed in Dauphin in the 1970s. But in fact, there are a whole lot of different ways that the program can be designed and can in fact be paid for.
Hello, I'm Terry Carter. I'm Chair of Poverty Free Thunder Bay, and Sarah was just up. So we've been on this campaign to raise the rates. And all throughout the last year, well, a few years, is there a better way? And this seems like a better way to do things. So I have a couple of questions. Is there a difference between the basic annual income? Because you're starting to hear people using that term instead of the guaranteed annual income.
Yeah.
And the second question is, like, how do we start advocating for guaranteed annual income? Because we did try one time. We were at submissions to the Ontario provincial government for their budget, and a lot of the MPPs just walked out, right? They didn't want to hear it. So, is there any suggestions what we could do?
People use the terms basic income and guaranteed minimum income, guaranteed annual income to mean all kinds of things, and they tend to use them interchangeably. Most people who are doing this kind of work try to distinguish between guaranteed annual income, which is sort of a refundable tax credit as I've described it, and a basic income, which is an across-the-board payout of X $1,000 per person, which you will recoup somehow through a progressive tax system. On the whole, a basic income costs a whole lot more than a guaranteed annual income. This is a much more modest, and I think a much more familiar kind of a proposal within the bang-up job of raising a lot of families out of poverty. Guaranteed income supplement for seniors is another form of guaranteed income or basic income, and it too has reduced the poverty rate among seniors. So we have bits and pieces of a guaranteed income. The great gaping hole in the system, and the one nobody wants to touch, is what we do about the working poor. You know, what we do about adults who work but don't make enough money working to actually live a decent lifestyle. How do we advocate for that? I think a lot of people have sort of reached the stage where we know something needs to be done. The labor market's not solving that problem. We see the consequences in our healthcare system and our education system in a lot of different places. So we know something needs to be done. And I think the way we advocate it is to ask these hard questions, start this conversation, and just make sure that we're talking about these issues. And even if we don't end up with a guaranteed annual income, we will end up with something better than what we currently have.
Hi, my name's Louise Bourgeois. I'm wondering if you've observed some kind of political change, because you were talking about the World Bank, and that seems like a
Yes.
radical
Draconian
change in
Yes.
policy, and I'm wondering
Yes.
if there has been a philosophical or political change with that organization.
Well, you'll notice they changed the title. Unconditional cash transfer is not guaranteed annual income, and it sounds much more fiscally responsible to some people, I guess. It's pretty much the same thing. I guess I use this as an example because it's so unexpected. It's so unexpected to have the World Bank supporting these kinds of schemes, or at least I find it unexpected.
Yeah.
And the World Bank has a certain credibility in some circles. And so it's kind of cool to see an organization that you wouldn't expect to support this kind of a program, supporting this kind of a program. Have I seen a big change in the World Bank? Probably not as much as most of us would have liked to have seen.
I know talking about two kinds of people is an old chestnut, but I'm sorry, I tend to divide the population into two kinds of people. Those who believe that the economy is here to serve the people, those who believe that the people are here to serve the economy.
Yes.
We tend to be stuck in North America in the one that believes that we are here, poor or whatever, is here to serve the economy. I don't know what we could do about it under those circumstances. But I wondered if, and of course they're not listening to science. Are there any similar studies in places that are social democratic, like Denmark or Sweden, where they're likely to have something of this kind and keep the money there to finish the study?
Oddly enough, no. The only 5 that have ever been conducted have been conducted in North America. And the 4 in the US were conducted from a very, what you might call fiscally conservative, Milton Friedman sort of aspect. This is it. This is pretty much it. This evidence is really the only current or recent evidence from a high-income country for this kind of a scheme.
What can people do about this, really?
Ordinary
people here. Does it work better in a small community than in a large country?
No, I don't think so. I think it might be politically easier. I mean, I'm not downplaying in any sense the political challenges that this kind of a scheme faces, particularly in a country like Canada, where income support is a provincial responsibility. And for most provinces, running a guaranteed income is not a possibility. That needs to be done federally. So, I mean, there are some real challenges we would face in this country. What can we do about it is to keep asking those hard questions. Why is it that? And see if we can do better.
Bill King. I was particularly interested in the high school figures you have for retention. As I taught high school for years, and a lot of teachers said if you could give the kids $20 cash every day, they'd turn up. Essentially, it looked like that was what they were doing. How did someone become eligible to collect the basic income?
It wasn't the kids who were getting the money. It was the kids' families who were getting the money. And if you think about decisions that are being made in the summer, for a lot of these kids, a lot of the kids at risk, and often it would have been farm kids, certainly kids in low-income families. And these families are going to be thinking about their income from all sources over the next year and whether or not they can continue to support this big boy for another year, or whether he should go out and become self-supporting. And a lot of those kids were under tremendous pressure from their families to become self-supporting. And what happened when the families got the guarantee was that they started to think, well, maybe the kid can stay in high school for another year. Maybe we won't put quite so much pressure on him. And so some of those kids did stay in school. And of course, it has a nice snowball effect, right? Because everybody in town is eligible. So once some of the kids start going to school, their friends look on and say, well, you know, my friends are staying in school for another year, maybe I'll stay in school for another year. And I think those are the results we see. I was certainly surprised by the size of the effect, but that is what some of the families told me was